Hi guys, hope you all doing well and welcome back to our series of Active Directory Federation services. And in this video, we are going to talk about multi-factor authentication. So if you're watching this series from the beginning, what we already know, what is a relying party trust. I've also discussed about the claim X-ray tool, and in the last video, we have covered claim provider trust. In this video, our scope will be knowing how multi-factor authentication works with ADFS and what are the different set of options that you can choose to configure MFA. So if we talk about multi-factor authentication and the set of options that are available with ADFS, you can configure Azure MFA, you can have Azure MFA server set up on-prem, you can use certificate authentication method as well as you can integrate third-party MFA providers. But now let's understand which operating system offers you what kind of capability by default and what are the different custom methods that are available. So if we talk about both the operating systems which we are discussing from the beginning, 2012 R2 and 2016, the default method on both these OS versions is certificate authentication, whereas 2016 gives you the capability to add Azure MFA or to use Azure MFA as a second factor authentication method. And this is something which is available by default. If we talk about custom method, you can have Azure MFA server set up for both the operating systems as well as you can integrate third-party MFA providers. Now, Azure MFA Server is something which I have already covered in a different playlist, and I will be sharing the link of that playlist in the description. If you guys want, you can go ahead and review that as well and get back to me if you have any questions. Now, the scope for this particular video will be knowing how certificate authentication works and how to configure Azure MFA as to complete second factor authentication. Now let's start off with Azure MFA itself and know some more details about Azure MFA. So this is a default option which is available with 2016 and you don't have to go ahead and install or add any service. It is available by default. The moment you'll set up ADFS, you'll get the option of Azure MFA and I'll show you where you can find it. All you have to do is you have to configure MFA, Azure MFA, in fact, as an authentication provider. And for that, all you have to do is you have to run these three commands. I will be sharing these three commands in the description section as well. Just copy them from the description and try running in your lab. Get yourself familiar first and then try it in your production environment if you are planning to go ahead and use Azure MFA as a second factor authentication. But make sure that you replace the tenant ID as I've shown here from the first and the second, and the third command, wherein this part has to be replaced with your tenant name. In our case, it'll be MCAS MIP, so I've just written it directly. Now let's move on and understand how Azure MFA is going to work with ADFS. Now, since we know that the application has to send the authentication request to ADFS to initiate primary authentication. And for that, what ADFS does, it actually contacts your Active Directory to present the credential that you are giving on ADFS page. That means if application is requesting a form-based authentication, ADFS will respond back with this page, and on this page, user has to enter username and password. Once it is verified from your AD, now the next step which ADFS has to do is to go ahead and check access control policies. So this is something which happens by default. In fact, if you don't have any policy that should go ahead and trigger MFA, ADFS will directly issue a token to your application. But if you have any policy that is configured to trigger MFA, ADFS will trigger MFA. Now, in our case, since we will implement this with Azure MFA, what will happen? A MFA request will be triggered by ADFS before providing a token to an application. Now, there is something which is very important and which you guys have to make sure that it is done for all the users, and that is that since it is Azure which is initiating MFA, what you have to make sure that the users for which you are enabling MFA are synced to Azure Active Directory and the proof of process is completed. That means all the users have registered themselves from the MFA setup page, and the link is aka.ms/MFA setup. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all this, because if you have configured Azure MFA on your ADFS, but the user has not submitted the details wherein the Azure MFA service should contact, likewise, if he has given a contact number or if he wants to receive a phone call, the Azure MFA service should be able to trigger a phone call. If this set of information is not available, the MFA will not get completed and ADFS will not send a token to the application. So there are two things which you have to keep on in mind, and that is, apart from configuring MFA settings on your ADFS server, make sure for all the users MFA proof of process is also completed. Now, once the Azure MFA is triggered, what could be the behavior that, as per the preference of the user, a user might receive a phone call, a text message, or a notification on the Authenticator app. Now, once the second factor authentication for the user will be completed, what ADFS will do is a token will be sent to your application, and there will be a set of different information in terms of uh, authent method providers as well as authent method references. Now, what do I mean by this? That the first prompt which ADFS has given to a user, wherein the user is typing username and password, that's something called form-based authentication. And now, since it's ADFS, which is also triggering MFA, all Azure MFA authentication will also be mentioned in the set of claims that are being sent by ADFS to your application. The same goes with the part which is called authent method references. This is something which contains the claim type value of claim description. If you remember, guys, schema.microsoft.com is something which we use while we create claim description. So as you can see, there is one more additional value which is coming in the response, and that is multiple authent. So these are the two set of information which will be included in that token which ADFS has given to an application after completing MFA. So now let's switch to my ADFS machine and see how everything works. So this is my ADFS machine. And as you can see, I'm in the section which says authentication methods, and I'm getting the option of multi-factor authentication. Now, all I have to do is I have to click on edit, and then I'll get the option of multi-factor, and here I will be selecting the option of Azure MFA. Click on apply. Okay, that's it. That's all you have to do. And now, if you guys remember, I've shown you three commands which you have to run, and I will be running these three commands. But before you run these three commands, make sure you are connected to MSol module, and that is something which you can do by running the command get-msol service, enter, and here you have to sign in with your global admin credential. Now, there is a reason behind this, because there is a credential that you will add in one of your service principal. If you'll closely observe the second command, it says New-MsolServicePrincipalCredential, and this is something which requires global admin credential. And anyways, you are using MSol, so you have to sign in with your global admin credentials. So now I'll use my first command to generate a certificate. It's not copied. I'll copy it again. Enter. So I'm getting this warning because this command I have run it before as well on my tenant, but since if you guys will be running it for the first time in your lab or in your production environment, you'll not get this warning. I'll go back and I'll copy the second command and I'll run it in PowerShell. Okay, copy, paste. Okay, and now the third command, make sure that you replace the tenant ID value with your directory name, and then everything will be configured. So as you can see that I'm getting the option of the authentication provider configuration data was successfully updated. Before the changes take an effect, restart your ADFS service. So I'll go to services.msc and I'll just restart my service. Once the service is restarted, all I have to do is I'll go to Claims X-ray tool and then I will try signing in with my username and password, and the expected behavior is the MFA should get triggered. But there is one more change which we have to do, and that is we have to let the ADFS know that for this relying party you have to do MFA now. So for that, what I'll do is I'll go to Edit Access Control Policy, and here I will select this option which says Permit Everyone and Require MFA. Now the moment I'll click on OK, this relying party will start getting prompted, or the users who are trying to sign into this relying party will start getting prompted to complete MFA. So I'll go to the browser now and I'll go to our link of ADFS help. From here, we'll go to claims X-ray, and here I will type my federation service name, form-based authentication, WS-Fed for fresh authentication, and now I will sign in with my username and password. Now, the expected behavior is that it will show me we are trying to send you a text message on your contact number, because when I tried signing in with a test user account, I have chosen my preference as a verification code. So that's exactly what has happened. And now I'll go ahead and I'll type the 6-digit code that I've received and I'll click on sign in. Now I'm signed in to my application. And if you guys remember, I was talking about two different claims. And as you can see that in authent method providers, I'm getting Azure Multifactor Authentication getting listed here. And here what you see is a different claim, which will be issued if you are doing multi-factor authentication. So this is how Azure MFA works with ADFS. Now, if I talk about certificate authentication, the process is same. You have to go to the same set of options and make slight changes. And what are those? In the authentication method, you'll get the option of Azure MFA because we have selected it before. Click here on edit and change it to certificate authentication. Remove this Azure MFA. Click on apply and then click on OK. Now, there is no change that you have to do here, because in access control policy, you are saying that ADFS has to complete MFA. Okay, but what option should ADFS choose to complete MFA is something which has been defined here. So now the change that we have done is we are saying that instead of going with Azure MFA, do a certificate authentication. But there is a couple of other information as well which is required to get the certificate authentication done, and that is a certificate. So for that, what I'll do is I'll switch to one of my machine which has been joined to this domain. It's a client machine. It's a Windows 10 OS. And here I am logged in with one of my AD account. And this is the account that I'm using. Its name is Enter. And in order to sign in or in order to get the second factor authentication completed with a certificate, what I have to do is I must have a certificate and then only it will be completed. So make sure that for the user for whom you are enabling certificate authentication, in the user store of certificate on their laptops or on their machines, make sure the personal folder has a user certificate present. Then only the certificate authentication will get completed, otherwise it will fail. So right now I don't have a certificate. I don't have in fact a user certificate. And let's see what will be the behavior if I try to access an application that requires MFA. So Claim X-Ray is an application that's been added to my ADFS and that requires MFA. It's fairly simple now. And I'm trying to access the same application now from my client machine, which doesn't have a user certificate. Let's see what happens. I'll sign in with my username and password and see. I'm getting an option here which is saying that select a certificate that you want to use for authentication. If you cancel this operation, please close your browser. But the fact is that I'm not getting any prompt to select the certificate. Now, the reason behind this is the user certificate is not available on this particular machine. So this covers one of the use case that in the scenarios when the users are getting back to you and saying that I'm not getting any prompt to select the certificate, you can think of this, or this could be one of the reason that the user certificate is not even present on that particular machine. So what I'll do now is I'll close this browser. I'll go back to my certificate pane. I'll right click here and I'll click on all tasks and I'll click on request new certificate. Now this is something which user can do, or if you want you can actually push the certificates as well. I'll click on next. I'll again click on next and then I'll select the option of user. I'll click on enroll and now I'm enrolled for a user certificate. And as you can see, I have a user certificate on my machine that's been issued to enter by my enterprise CA. That means what? If now I will try to sign in the application which requires certificate auth to be completed, I should be prompted to select a particular certificate. So what I'll do is I'll go back to browser and I'll sign in into that application with my username and password. And then let's see whether this browser gives any prompt to select the certificate or not. Same set of options: form-based authentication, WSFed, force fresh authentication, test authentication. And now I'll try to sign in with my username and password. I'm getting the option to choose the certificate. And if you'll click on certificate information, this is the same certificate which we have just requested. So if you'll see, if I go here in the thumbprint, you see it's 6C21, and if we go back to the browser, 6C21. Now the moment I will click on the certificate and I will click on OK, I'm signed in back to my application. And as I said you before, in fact, what I've shown you before, that in authent method providers, we were getting some options, if you guys remember. And now you can see that I'm getting an option which says multiple authentication done, but you have selected a certificate. You see X509, and it's pretty much highlighted here that apart from form-based authentication, a certificate authentication is being done by a user. So now if we talk about the flow of what exactly happens when you choose certificate authentication. For certificate authentication, all a user has to do is he or she will be presented to choose a certificate on port 49443. Now, once the user is prompted to select a certificate, user has to just select the certificate that's been intended for him or her and make sure that certificate is stored on that particular machine which user is using. This could be internal certificate, or if you have a different PKI environment, if there must be a user certificate, that should be, the primary objective to check if certificate authentication is failing. So now let's talk about a quick summary of what all we have covered in this particular video. We have talked about multi-factor authentication. We have talked about Azure MFA. We have also discussed about certificate authentication. In the next video, I'm going to talk about ADFS proxy. If you guys have any questions, feedback, or suggestion, please feel free to reach me at learnconceptswork@gmail.com. And if you guys have learned something new, please feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for your time. Bye bye.